Thank you for coming out to Halifax today. I think there's a lot to be learned about black soldiers in both the militia and the Continental Army during the American Revolution. There's still a lot more research to be done. And I think a lot of people, when they think about black patriots during the American Revolution, think more of some of the New England continental lines. Salem Poor was he was at Concord Bridge and Bunker Hill, early war. Oliver Cromwell was in the 2nd New Jersey Regiment. He received the badge of military merit from George Washington. Also, Peter Salem, he was in the Massachusetts militia and was credited with mortally wounding the British Lieutenant Colonel James Abercrombie at Bunker Hill. And then probably the most famous in the research of black patriots is the 1st Rhode Island Regiment, which was a regiment that was made up of slaves. In return for their service, they were offered an opportunity for freedom. For this particular slide, though, we're going to shift gears from some of those more famous black patriots and focus more on what was going on here in North Carolina. And so to start off with, I want to talk a little bit about the demographics of North Carolina during the colonial period. So the eastern part of North Carolina, with a dependence on plantation economy and production of cash crops like tobacco, rice, and maritime supplies, tended to have higher percentages of slaves than the interior of the colony. So Halifax County was a major tobacco production area. Colonial taxable records suggest that 40 to 60% of the households owned slaves. And of the families that owned slaves in Halifax County, 8.7 slaves was the average on the 1790s census. So one of the things that we're dealing with any of this research, especially colonial period, revolution period in North Carolina, is just a lack of material. We have tax documents that have demographic information on slaves, but don't necessarily cover free blacks. And we don't really get a census until the 1790 census to kind of give us an idea. So it's really difficult to say exactly how many free blacks were in Halifax or in North Carolina at the beginning of the American Revolution. So based on the 1790 census, free non-whites made up about 3.2% of the population in Halifax County. And this is a quote from William Tryon in 1765. What he says is that Negroes are very numerous, I suppose 5 to 1 white person in the maritime counties, but as you penetrate into the country, few blacks are employed. So what he's saying is that these coastal large plantation regions have a higher black population than the areas to the west, which are more smaller farms, kind of more of a subsistence farming economy to the further west. It should also be noted that many of the enslaved people living in North Carolina, as well as free blacks, were new trades and had a variety of skills. And here's a 1778 North Carolina Gazette. It says, "To be sold for ready money, 2 likely young Negro fellows, the one a very good cooper, the other a good sailor, and has also been used to plantation work." So, a lot of these people are doing a lot of different work. They have exposure to a lot of the same trades that whites are being exposed to, especially in the East. Halifax at the beginning of the American Revolution. It's been estimated that between 1,200 and 1,400 people resided in Halifax at the start of the Revolution. So this was a much larger town. This was a pretty major transportation hub. We're at the terminal point of the Roanoke River. Just upriver from here in Weldon, there's a series of rapids, and they couldn't get any ocean-going vessels further upriver from there. So at this point, they're loading and unloading vessels. And if you look at the scheme of things as well, during the colonial period, there's no Raleigh, places like Charlotte are really just a crossroads during this time period. I mean, Hillsborough is your biggest western town during this period. So North Carolina is it's a different topography than our current mindset. As I mentioned, it's 1,200 to 1,400 people in Halifax then. Now, was it 250 is how many people live in Halifax now?
Between 250 and 270.
Yeah, so you really have to think about Halifax differently during that period than you do today. Free blacks in the law. North Carolina Colonial Assembly passed a law in 1715 prohibiting the right to vote amongst free blacks. So early 18th century, we start seeing these first slave codes coming in. And this was the first in a series of laws that were designed to keep the population of free blacks in the colony small and disenfranchised. Both North Carolina and Virginia had laws ordering newly freed slaves to leave their respective colony within 6 months or be re-enslaved. So what you have, especially a place like Halifax, which is very close to the border, did I say states? I mean colonies. Anyway, with North Carolina, with this part of North Carolina, you've got a lot of freed blacks crossing the border into North Carolina from Virginia and vice versa, which allows someone to be possibly closer to family and relatives, but still not have to worry about this aspect of the law. The 1790s census, free non-whites made up about 3.2% of the population of Halifax County. 1737, the king ordered the 1715 voting law repealed, so free blacks could now vote in North Carolina. And then in 1776, the 5th Provincial Congress, so the Provincial Congress right after the 4th Provincial Congress with the Halifax Resolves, the next Provincial Congress, which met in Halifax, ratified the state constitution for North Carolina. And this document made no distinction between races regarding suffrage. So at this period, you have free blacks able to vote. Free black men retained the right to vote in North Carolina until 1835. So shortly after the Nat Turner Rebellion, they revoked the right for free blacks to vote in North Carolina. At that time, it was estimated that there were 300 black electors in Halifax. And a little section from the Act to establish a militia for the security and defense of this province. Militia service in North Carolina was compulsory throughout the 18th century. And in the actual words of the law, that all free men and servants within this province between the age of 16 and 60 shall compose the militia. So that also includes free blacks. And this is an excerpt of a muster roll of the regiment in Granville County, October 1754. So this is just part of the muster roll. But if you take a look at this, they put on here that they mark some of the gentlemen on here as being black or mulatto, Gilbert Shavers is on here, marked as mulatto. William Shavers is being a Negro. Edward Harris. So, I mean, this is kind of a rare gem where they actually mark on here people's races. There's probably tons of other, there's a lot more information out there where they just didn't say whether people were black or white. So this is one of the ways that I say that we're at kind of the tip of the iceberg on this. It's really difficult to know how many free blacks were serving in the militia during the period. So bring us up to the American Revolution, April 19th of 1775. Lexington and Concord takes place up in Massachusetts. And around the same time, the governor of Virginia is making some moves to recruit enslaved individuals. So in 1772, John Murray, the 4th Earl of Dunmore and last Royal Governor of Virginia, in a letter to Lord Dartmouth, the British Secretary of State for the colony, discussed the colonists' fear of a slave revolt and the potential for a foreign power to recruit the support of slaves. So he's kind of thinking about this even before the American Revolution. And then basically takes his own, something he's posting as being a concern before the revolution. He kind of takes that idea and runs with it. On April 20th of 1775, Dunmore removed gunpowder from the magazine in Williamsburg to a British ship. And this caused a big deal in Virginia. A lot of it was kind of a bad PR move for Dunmore. On April 22nd, in response to angry mobs, Dunmore tells the mayor of Williamsburg that he would be willing to destroy the town and proclaim liberty for slaves. And that's, if you look at the mindset of white planters in the South during this period, that's kind of their worst nightmare coming true, is this idea of a slave revolt. June 8th, Dunmore and his family flee Williamsburg and wind up living in exile aboard the HMS Fowey. I don't know if I pronounced that correctly. So Dunmore creates a regiment made out of ex-slaves, and he calls this the Ethiopian Regiment. November 15th, 1775, Dunmore declares martial law in Virginia, and all indentured servants, Negroes, or others appertaining to rebels all Negroes or others appertaining to rebels, in parentheses, free that are able and willing to bear arms, they joining His Majesty's troops. So in any way, he's trying to recruit the slaves of what he calls the rebels, what today a lot of people would probably call the Patriots. And something that, when I'm talking about the American Revolution, just to keep my life simple, I'm going to call the pro-independence Americans Patriots. We'll just use that term to keep it simple. Although it is more complex than that, because you also have Americans that are loyalists as well. So one of the major battles that Dunmore's Ethiopian Regiment serves in is the Battle of Great Bridge. And during that battle, we also have the destruction of Norfolk taking place. And that was the Battle of Great Bridge also has soldiers from Halifax going up to it. We have members of the Halifax Minutemen that are there, and they're also there at the bombardment of the town of Norfolk. This is Dunmore's Ethiopian Regiment causes a big stir, and even Washington reacts about it. Dunmore should be instantly crushed. Otherwise, like a snowball rolling, his army will get size. That was George Washington's reaction to Dunmore's Ethiopians in November of 1775. And I put a couple of pictures of Washington with his servant Billy Lee on here. On the the second picture, this one here, Washington's actually holding the Declaration of Independence, and the black gentleman behind him was his valet, and also one of his slaves, who basically was going with him everywhere throughout the American Revolution. April 12th, 1776. The reason we're all here today, we have the Halifax Resolves, and we're probably all familiar with the resolve that delegates from this colony in the Continental Congress be empowered to concur with the delegates of other colonies in declaring independency. So, this is some of the earliest moves of a colony in North America pushing towards independence from Great Britain. That's what the Halifax Resolves are famous for. Dunmore's proclamation had an effect on a lot of on-the-fence whites in the South, especially planters, that sort of helped polarize some undecided white colonists towards independence. So, amongst other grievances of British rule, the Halifax Resolves also references that, in the words of the document, that governors in different colonies have declared protection to slaves who should imbrue their hands in the blood of their masters. So that's a direct reference to Dunmore's Ethiopian Regiment. They're basically calling Dunmore as inciting a slave revolt. So that's blacks on the loyalist side, and there's a number of other blacks that serve on the loyalist and the British side. There's a whole group of black pioneers that serve on the British side. Some of the members of Dunmore's Ethiopians wind up in the pioneer regiments, and by the end of the war, a lot of these black loyalists wind up getting transported out of America. So when New York is liberated by the Patriots at the end of the war, the British take about 3,000 blacks with them. And at one point, some of these veterans of service with the Loyalist cause are involved with setting up a colony in Sierra Leone. Now, obviously, the name of this talk is Black Patriots, and that's really what I want to focus on. When we talk about Black Patriots here in North Carolina, we're mostly talking about free blacks enlisting in the Patriot militia and also in the Continental Army. North Carolina never really has a program like the first Rhode Island that offers freedom for enslaved individuals. Also, Virginia experiments with that as well, but North Carolina never really enacts legislation like that, as far as I could find. While the British offered liberty for enslaved blacks willing to serve the king, free blacks had other motivations. Free blacks served in both the Patriot militias and also in the Continental Army. Patriot forces were generally integrated with black and white soldiers serving side by side. And it has been estimated, and that's an important thing to think about also, is that the Continental Army is an integrated army. And I think that's a really important thing for people to understand that there are blacks that are part of this Continental Army militia experience and serving side by side with their white compatriots in the same army that are messing together. When I say that, I mean eating together, sharing tents. I wasn't able to find any documentation on black NCOs in North Carolina. But like I said, I'm kind of at the tip of the iceberg on this. I feel like I wouldn't be even surprised to find that. There's no As far as I can tell, the Continental Line never has any black officers, though, as far as I can find. But we look at, even in World War II, we didn't have a fully integrated army. It has been estimated that 5,000 black soldiers served in the Continental Army during the American Revolution. A muster roll for Continental Army stationed in White Plains, New York in August of 1778 listed 755 black soldiers in the ranks. 58 of these soldiers were serving with the North Carolina line. So, and that's something else to think about, is those soldiers serving in New York, most of them are walking up there. So we have soldiers walking from Halifax all the way up to New York, and we have soldiers walking from Halifax all the way down south to Charleston, South Carolina. So these guys are, they don't have an easy ride. It's a very, especially when you look at poor equipment, just to have that kind of commitment to go through with that. Served with the next, I want to kind of take a case study here of a specific Continental soldier, Billy Flora. He served with the Virginia Southern Princess Anne District Minute Battalion at the Battle of Great Bridge on December 9th of 1775. While awaiting reinforcements from Colonel Robert Howe's North Carolina forces, Flora was serving as a sentry when a company of British Grenadiers attacked his position. And in quotations, Billy Flora, a colored man, was the last sentinel that came into the breastworks, and that he did not leave his post until he had fired several times. Billy had to cross a plank to get into the breastwork and had fairly passed over it when he was seen to turn back and deliberately take up the plank after him amid a shower of musket balls. So this gentleman is the hero of this battle. In 1776, Flora would re-enlist in the 15th Virginia Regiment and served through the remainder of the war. His commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Matthews, described him as being held in high esteem as a soldier. The next thing I tried to look at was pension applications with connections to Halifax. And this is I did a quick search of a list of pension applications, and anything that had Halifax in it, I put up here. And these are just 10 of them right in front of me. I can't rule out that there's not, and these are just basically the ones that had some reference to the soldier being of African American descent. There's probably other soldiers that just wasn't even listed in the pension. Edward Going was a 5th North Carolina, a member of the 5th North Carolina. He was stationed in Halifax. This was a Continental Army supply depot. They were making equipment for the Continental Army here in Halifax. Benjamin Wilkins, 2nd North Carolina, was a resident of Halifax. And in his pension report, he said that he thinks he has killed at least 50 British and Tories. William Casey, also listed as Kersey, was in the Virginia 4th Regiment, 1777 to 1781, and was transferred to the 1st North Carolina Regiment in 1782. He was a waiter to General Sumter in the 1st North Carolina, and as part of his enlistment, marched through Halifax. Moses Manley, he was, and do you remember these pension applications? These gentlemen are writing this down late in life. These are being taken in the 1830s. So some of them have trouble recollecting which regiment they were in. Moses Manley of the 1st or 2nd North Carolina Regiment in 1781, served for 12 months. He was a resident of Halifax. Charles Rowe, and these are, like as I mentioned again, these are primarily free blacks. Charles Rowe of Butte County was a militia in 3rd North Carolina Regiment. He served 9 months, and he was a levy from the militia. So he was serving in the militia, and he was drafted into the Continental Army. They would draft some soldiers out of the militia. Asa Spellmore or Spellman was a 10th North Carolina Regiment soldier, 1778, 9-month enlistment, discharged in Halifax. I should also mention that some of these soldiers may be, it's common at the time, it's almost as a patriotic duty. I've found accounts of people that wanted to contribute to the war effort would actually pay a soldier to go in their place. So some of these soldiers may have been part of that as well, basically serving in place or as substitutes for other soldiers, or excuse me, for other citizens of Halifax. Joel Taburn was North Carolina, 10th North Carolina Regiment, 1776, 1783, marched from Halifax, North Carolina to White Plains, New York, then back south again through Halifax to Charleston, South Carolina, where he was discharged. So this guy went all the way to New York and then all the way back down to Charleston. John Womble, he was in the 3rd or the 10th North Carolina Regiment, 1779 to 1780, was recruited in Halifax. Arthur Toney was in the 3rd North Carolina Regiment, 1779 to 1783. He was also a resident of Halifax. And John Toney, they were brothers. Served in the 10th North Carolina Regiment, 12 months in 1781, also a resident of Halifax. The most famous African-American continental soldier with connections to Halifax is probably John Chavis. John Chavis moved to Halifax around 1766 from Sussex County, Virginia. And as an indentured servant, as an indentured servant to attorney James Milner. Chavis enlisted in December of 1778 in the 5th Virginia and served for 3 years. In the bounty warrant written March of 1783 certified that Chavis had faithfully fulfilled his duties and thereby entitled to all immunities granted to 3-year soldiers in the Continental Service. After the war, he becomes employed as a tutor in Mecklenburg, Virginia. We see a reference to that in 1789. Then in 1790, he attended the College of New Jersey, today Princeton University, and later Liberty Hall Academy in Lexington, Virginia, today Washington and Lee University. November 19th of 1800, he was granted a license to preach by the Presbytery of Lexington, Virginia, and served as a minister in Virginia, Maryland, and North Carolina. And by some accounts, I've seen Chavis listed as the first African-American Presbyterian minister in North America. I'm not totally sure about that. 1807 or 1808, he relocates to Raleigh and opened a school intended to serve both black and white children. And this school appears to be an integrated school early on. But unfortunately, Chavis was pressured into segregating the school by the fall of 1808. So in the August 26th, 1808 edition of the Raleigh Register, it talks a little bit, it says, John Chavis takes this method of informing his employers and the citizens of Raleigh in general that the present quarter of this school will end on the 15th of September, and the next will commence on the 19th. he will at this same time upon an evening school open an evening school for the purpose of instructing children of color, as he intends for the accommodation of some of his employers to exclude all children of color from his day school. So he winds up having to do a night school for his African American students of the pressure of some of his white clients. The evening school will commence at an hour by sun. When the white children leave the house, those of color will take their place and continue until 10 o'clock. The terms of teaching the white children will be as usual, $2.50 per quarter. Those of color, $1.75. In both cases, the whole of the money be paid in advance to Mr. Benjamin S. King. Those who produce certificates from him of their having paid the money will be admitted. Those who think proper to put their children under his care may rely upon the strictest attention being paid not only to their education, but to their morals, which he deems an important part of education. So, John Chavis may have had this man as one of his students. Willie P. Magnum may have been one of his students. If he was not one of John Chavis's students, they had a close relationship. So Willie Magnum was a U.S. Senator for North Carolina, and there's a number of letters between John Chavis and Willie Magnum, and they were close friends. John Chavis would advise Willie Magnum on political decisions. John Chavis was visiting him from time to time. Later on, after Magnum's death, Willie Magnum's son would try and would basically say that John Chavis had not been a teacher of Willie Magnum. It's still sort of up for debate, but John Chavis did act as a teacher for some very influential and important people in Raleigh in the early 19th century. In the wake of the Nat Turner Rebellion, so August 1831, Nat Turner leads a slave revolt in Southampton County, Virginia, killing at least 51 whites. North Carolina, there is a huge backlash against free blacks at this point. North Carolina law forbids the teaching of black children, so that shuts down John Chavis's school. It also forbids blacks from serving as preachers, which shuts down John Chavis as a minister. He's forced to close his school and leave the ministry. Nonetheless, the presbytery would continue to support Chavis with a $50 per year payment until his death in 1838. And this quote is a part of a very powerful letter that John Chavis wrote to Willie P. Magnum March 10th of 1832. Tell them, if I am black, I am free-born American and a revolutionary soldier, and therefore ought not to be thrown entirely out of the scale of notice. Well, thank you very much, folks, and nice talking to you.